I'm going to read today from the book of Exodus, chapter 1, and then I'm going to move around a little bit. I think what I'd like to touch on today, speaking to myself and to anyone else who's listening, is the idea of obedience to God as opposed to obedience to men. Let's go back to verse 13, chapter 1 of Exodus. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. That's the Egyptians ruling over the Israelite people. Verse 15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. So we see here, if you've ever read that bumper sticker, obedient women rarely make history or never make history. Well, here we see a case of women disobeying the king or the Pharaoh of Egypt, but obeying God, being obedient to God, and being honored by God because of that. It also takes great courage. They're under the microscope. Takes great courage to go against the decrees of a king. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. We'll continue on, beginning in chapter 2 of Exodus. Again, I'm speaking about faith in God, trust in God, obedience to God. And in human terms, I'm speaking of courage. Chapter 2, verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes, daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister, that's Moses' sister, stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant women, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called the child's mother, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, I drew him out of the water. Isn't that amazing? God's provision and God's plan. And it's brought about by the obedience of his people. The parents, Moses' parents, not fearing. We'll read later in the New Testament where it says they were not afraid. I'm moving us into the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 11, beginning at verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. I'm sure almost every parent thinks their child is beautiful. I read something else into this. They saw perhaps something special about the boy outside of his physical beauty. And I'm not sure about that, but I'm just guessing. The end of that verse says they were not afraid of the king's edict. I wonder if I could bear up under that. If I would be reverent to God, obedient to God in similar circumstances. Verse 24, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. The key word, I believe, is choosing to be mistreated. Paul speaks about the sufferings of this world are nothing compared to the glory that's to be revealed. And here we see Moses making that decision. We will read later how Moses was treated as an Egyptian. He was an educated man, a learned man, a wealthy man. He was raised by the daughter. He was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and he throws that all aside to suffer. I mean, that's essentially what's happening. It's obedience in the face of suffering. Verse 26, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. Verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king. For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Verse 26 is interesting. The reproach of Christ. The writer of Hebrews draws no distinction between God and Jesus. The reproach of Christ in the Old Testament. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth, not God, but the reproach of Christ greater wealth. I think he's speaking to us there, right? Christians are counterculture if we're standing up. And I mean preaching the gospel. That's what I mean when I say standing up. And I'm not saying I do that the way that I should.